Thank you very much indeed. And could I therefore kick off, please, and thank you for finally releasing the list of ministerial responsibilities after much prompting from this committee and others. It's noticeable within the Cabinet Office that many of your junior ministers, quotes, support you in various policy areas. So is ministerial accountability clear within the Cabinet Office?
Yes.
And in their support, could you describe the nature of it?
Yes. Obviously, it depends on the different areas which I discharge. But in short order, the Minister for the Constitution and Devolution supports me in making sure not just that the intergovernmental relations that the Cabinet Office oversees, meetings of the Joint Committee on European negotiations and so on, run smoothly, but she is also heavily involved in policy work, whether that relates to specific constitutional issues like the reform of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, or how we can make sure that the UK internal market works best. One of the reasons for a delay in finalising all of the responsibilities was that Julia Lopez, another one of the very talented junior ministers in the department, was in Australia because of the at the time that the COVID pandemic broke. It was only when Julia came back that we were able to finalise all of them. It's also the case that sometimes responsibilities shift within the department. We have a joint minister, for example, with HM Treasury, Lord Agnew. He has recently acquired additional responsibility for some HMRC-related issues in connection with the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Okay. And moving on with that theme, is it clear where accountability lies between the civil service and ministers?
Yes, the buck stops with ministers.
So what are permanent secretaries accountable for as opposed to ministers?
Well, permanent secretaries, of course, like all civil servants, work to ensure that the government of the day's priorities are implemented. But ultimately, of course, it is the case that we are accountable as ministers to Parliament, and we bear direct accountability for the actions of our departments.
And so where does responsibility lie when policy goes wrong, with the minister or with the civil servant?
Sometimes it can be many ministers where the responsibility lies. The judgment as to when policy goes wrong, of course, is rarely a definitive one which gets 100% consensus.
No, but broadly speaking, it tends to be reasonably obvious, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so how can we tell whether the civil service or the government that's responsible for that broad consensus of things not going quite to plan?
Well, I think that there's generally a wealth of evidence, and select committees are often expert at both unearthing and analysing it, to draw conclusions about why things have gone wrong in particular areas. And of course, that judgment is one which is never a science, but relies, of course, on the assessment of evidence and then the exercise of judgment.
And so do you appreciate the difference between responsibility and accountability?
Yes. I mean, again, ministers are accountable to Parliament, and they're responsible for what goes on in their departments, and they take responsibility for that. No minister, given the way in which modern government works, will be aware of every submission circulating within that department, every decision that might be made, every administrative process that might go on. For example, my colleague, who's the Secretary of State at the Department of Work and Pensions, is responsible for one of the largest civil service workforces, providing one of the most important services. But if a single universal credit mistake is made, that is deeply regrettable for the individual involved. But I don't think anyone would say that that was, well, ultimately the person who's accountable for it and who'd want to investigate why, if it were part of a broader systemic failure, that systemic failure had been allowed to continue, would be the Secretary of State. No one, I think, would say that that individual bug in the system was her or his fault.
No, but that's a very specific example. What about broad policy? I mean, take purely at random a department that, such as the Department of Education, that presumably knew that examinations weren't taking place and that therefore there might be some issue with an important aspect of its work. And then very senior officials, whether in the department or indeed an agency, determined that they should fall on their swords Is it not peculiar that a minister might not do the same?
Well, I've been Secretary of State for Education in the past, and I appreciate how complex many of these questions are. I know that the Education Select Committee has taken evidence, I think, from Ofcall and others about this question. I would say that the challenges that were faced by governments across the United Kingdom as a result of the COVID pandemic were unprecedented. And there was a broad consensus that in the circumstances where it would be difficult to press ahead with examinations, that an alternative method of assessment had to be found. But because it was unprecedented, inevitably it was a challenging delivery environment.
And so you agree that responsibility can be shared, but that accountability rests solely with the minister concerned?
Ultimate accountability rests with the minister, yes.
And so, but much like Harry Truman, it'd be helpful if ministers had that motto on their desk of the book stopping with them.
I think most ministers are conscious. I remember Jack Straw saying that when he was Home Secretary, he was very conscious of the fact that at any given moment there were things happening in his department which could lead to unfortunate political consequences for him. It's part of political life. But my other view also is that wherever possible, and it's a point that I made in the context of the civil service, we should ensure that experience, authority, deep subject expertise is prized, and so we would want to keep people, particularly people who are passionate about delivering in a particular area, in post or in that area or in that region for as long as possible.
And so in order to clarify where that heavy responsibility lies, should the civil service be more willing to ask for formal ministerial directions, or do you think it's more likely that they will in light of recent events?
I don't think it's more likely, but I think sometimes it's appropriate, and I've issued them myself in the past.
Thank you. Karen Smith, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Gove, we corresponded as a committee with you over the summer about the internal market bill. And we now have what I think we can all agree is an extraordinarily quick parliamentary timetable to pursue the bill. We are also expecting the government's Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission to report. So can you talk us through the government's view about how the speed of this bill, in light of other constitutional bills we're expecting, really respects the various parts of the United Kingdom and will enhance our democracy and rights for people across the United Kingdom?
Yes, I think the important thing to stress about the UK internal market bill is that it's primarily an economic measure. And that's why it's the business department that is leading on it. And the UK internal market bill is there to ensure that as we leave the European Union, for the last 40 years, many of the rules that have governed the circulation of goods within the UK have been EU single market goods, EU single market rules, forgive me, that we have a robust legal framework to underpin that. You mentioned the Constitution Commission. It is the case that inevitably there are constitutional matters which we'll need to address in this Parliament, including the repeal of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and so on. But in the meantime, one of the reasons for making sure that we can proceed with the UK internal market bill is that businesses have told us that they would prefer to have certainty at the end of the transition period on how the UK internal market will operate.
Thank you.
David Jones, please. David Mundell.
Can I just, Mr Gove, as you're with us, ask you something specific on the internal markets bill? Because one of the dangers of proceeding at pace is that misinformation abounds. And one piece of misinformation I'm concerned about is the suggestion that the internal markets bill could impact on the Barnett formula. And I wonder if you're in a position just to categorically rule that out.
Yes, I can. There's nothing in the UK internal market that will or is intended to in any way bear on or have an impact on the Barnett formula. The Barnett formula is a tried and trusted way of making sure that the unique needs of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland within our United Kingdom are protected when it comes to the allocation of expenditure. Of course, there is some expenditure out with the Barnett formula. For example, it is the case, we touched on DWP earlier, that DWP administer universal credit across the whole country, but the Barnett formula is not imperilled in any way by this bill.
Obviously, in the Chamber next week, there will be an opportunity to debate the impact of the bill on the devolution settlements. But can you set out for us what the government's vision, overall vision, for devolution within the United Kingdom is, or indeed is there one within government?
Yes, there is. Our overall vision is that we believe that devolution provides the best of both worlds, and that in all of those parts of the United Kingdom in which there are devolved administrations, both governments should work together for the good of our citizens. So your constituents have the Scottish Government responsible, obviously, for the delivery of education. It's responsible for the administration of our UK National Health Service in Scotland, and it's responsible for a plethora of other important matters, all of which were clearly devolved in the original devolution legislation, and indeed more powers have been given to Holyrood since then, not least in the Scotland Act, which you had such an important role in bringing to the House of Commons and through the House of Commons. At the same time, we also believe that every part of the United Kingdom benefits from the broad shoulders of the UK Treasury, from the strength of the common ties that bind us. And so the important way, I think, to proceed is to make sure that both governments work in the interests of all. And I think that's the position of other unionist parties like the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. Each of us might have our own ideas about individual aspects of the Constitution, but all of us recognise that strength. Of course, our colleagues from the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru would prefer just to have one government working on its own for the individual parts of the United Kingdom. I don't believe that's right, but of course I respect the argument.
In terms of the relationship of the UK government with the devolved administrations and parliaments, a report was commissioned from Lord Dunlop into how that relationship could be improved and that the UK government could act more effectively in relation to its responsibilities and relationships. And when the Minister for the Constitution, for whom I have a lot of respect, was before this committee, I mean, her answers in our simple question of whether that report was going to be published were frankly unsatisfactory. And I wonder perhaps if you could clarify whether the Dunlop report will be published.
Yes, it will. It's an excellent report. It makes a series of practical recommendations. Many of those recommendations are in the process of being implemented. The approach that I wanted to take, and any deficiency in answering the questions will have been as a result of what I was doing rather than anything that the Minister
The buck was stopping with you.
The buck was stopping with me.
Yeah.
And my approach was that I wanted to make sure that when we publish the Dunlop report, we can say not this is a plan of action which we're punting into the future, but these are a series of recommendations, and you can see that we have responded to all of them. Some of the recommendations in the report we're implementing in a slightly different way from the way in which Lord Dunlop argued for, but overall it is an excellent report. So, I want to thank him for it, and we will publish it.
So when?
Later this year.
No greater specificity than that?
No. Again, one of the things that I want to do is to make sure, without prejudice to the views of the devolved administrations, that we can conclude a review of intergovernmental relations. I'm very keen that we should do that. The Minister for Constitution and Devolution is working on that. When that cake is baked, if it is, then the report can be published. That depends on progress with the devolved administrations, and to be fair to all the devolved administrations, they've been very, very keen to make progress on it, though there are still one or two bits of contention.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chairman, just to clarify.
Sure.
You'll publish the report in full and
say
what you have done in respect to
exactly. What we want to do is to publish the report, to thank Lord Dunlop, and to explain what we've done in order to implement it, and where we disagree about aspects of implementation, to explain, not because we think his reasoning is wrong, but just because some circumstances have moved on.
Okay, Ronnie Caron, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to tidy something that you said earlier on, Mr. Gove, you said that the devolved powers were defined in the Scotland Act. The devolved powers are not defined in the Scotland Act. The reserved powers are defined, and if it's not reserved, then it is devolved by default. So coming to the UK Internal Market Bill, this bill, and you also said it does not affect Barnett, but this bill allows the UK government to impose their projects on the people of Scotland, and therefore that could affect funding set aside for schools and hospitals. So the funding can be affected, determined by how you use this bill. This bill is so open in many things that it can do, that it can undermine food standards in Scotland, agriculture in Scotland, and building projects in Scotland. Also undermines the laws in Scotland. I cannot see how you can possibly justify this as being a good thing for a healthy, devolved Parliament.
A number of very important points you raised, Ronnie. The first thing is the UK government imposing things on Scotland. Well, it depends on how you use that verb. I mean, the UK government, you can argue, has imposed the furlough scheme in Scotland, has imposed Eat Out to Help Out in Scotland, has imposed the Barnett formula on Scotland. It is the case that the broad shoulders of the UK government and the Treasury have meant that public spending in Scotland, both through the Barnett formula and through these other measures, has been higher than in other parts of the United Kingdom. Quite right too. I would always defend it, and I sometimes have to defend it to colleagues from other parts of the United Kingdom. So it's not a matter of imposition, it's a matter of sharing and working together and respecting the devolution settlement. And the whole point about the devolution settlement is that there is a role for both governments working together. And that's what that bill brings even more firmly into focus. You made a point about apparent dangers on food standards, agriculture, and so on. Not at all. Stuff and nonsense. I mean, the case is that when you think about agriculture in Scotland, which is a critically important part of Scotland's economy, the administration of agriculture in Scotland, the disbursement of support to farmers, environmental regulations, these are all devolved matters and a good thing too. And in fact, it is the case that as a result of our departure from the European Union, the Scottish Government has additional powers to control what happens in agriculture, which it didn't have before.
You talk about mutual recognition of standards. So if it's mutual recognition, that can be imposed on the UK government.
No, I think that's a misunderstanding on your part. Let me complete the point. It is the case that your colleague and my friend Fergus Ewing has brought forward legislation in the Scottish Parliament to simplify the Common Agricultural Policy and to alter it in circumstances which are uniquely in Scotland's interests. He would not have been able to have brought forward the legislation in the way that he has if Scotland were still in the EU. Now, my understanding of the Scottish Government's position is that it would like Scotland to leave the United Kingdom and to re-enter the EU. If it were the case that Scotland did that, then the additional freedoms that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government will enjoy after the December the 31st would no longer exist. It would be an odd thing. It would be an odd thing. No. Let me finish, Ronnie, and then I'm sure you can come back. It would be an odd thing, as again the former Scottish Government Minister Alec Neil has pointed out, and indeed the former Deputy Leader of the SNP, Jim Sillars, has pointed out, for a movement which wants greater independence to separate from the United Kingdom and then to make itself within the EU more dependent on a body over which it exercised less influence and in the process to relinquish powers.
That's not what we're talking about here today. You're going to a completely different channel here. That's not what we're talking about here. I think you have to really reread clause 46 if you honestly believe that you're not imposing upon the opportunities for the Scottish Government to impose its own powers and its own food standards and its own building projects. Reread clause 46. This is not just a Scottish National Party thing. The Labour Welsh Government has also made clear it vehemently opposes this process.
Well, I'm sure that we will find that there'll be lots of Labour voices discussing how we can make the United Kingdom stronger. That's the shared commitment of everyone I know within the Labour Party. But, you know, we take a different position. You know, Conservatives, this government, want to make devolution work. The Scottish National Party, a perfectly legitimate position, doesn't believe in devolution. It doesn't want devolution to work. It wants devolution to fail because it wants independence, separation, then rejoining the European Union and the surrender of additional powers and autonomy that Scotland and the whole of the United Kingdom would enjoy.
Well, that would be a matter for the people of Scotland.
Well, of course people will vote in the future on these questions, but the key thing I would say is that the Scottish National Party position, as I pointed out, very distinguished nationalist figures like Jim Sillars and Alec Neil and others have pointed out the logical inconsistency in it, is to separate from the United Kingdom in order to be more dependent on another political entity.
Thank you, Ronnie. Just in terms of housekeeping, obviously down the line it's difficult and speaking over one another is never edifying, so if you could bear that in mind.
I'll try and keep my answers shorter.
Very kind. Karen Smith, please.
Yes, if I can just come back. So I think what we've heard is that the government has this excellent report. We take your word for how excellent it is, because obviously nobody's seen it. In fact, you are implementing the report, but you're not publishing it, but you are progressing with the Internal Market Bill, which I think everyone would recognise, and we're starting to hear, is hugely controversial and at least desettling for the devolved regions. How can you be doing those things simultaneously? Why don't you just publish Dunlop now in advance of the bill?
Well, the report bears on a range of areas where we can make the union work better, but the UK Internal Market Bill is primarily an economic measure that is required as a result of our departure from the European Union, which provides us with significant additional opportunities as well. But I think it's fair to say that unless something unprecedented happens, that the Dunlop report will be published before the UK Internal Market Bill reaches the statute book. The other point that I would make is that with the UK Internal Market Bill, there is a broad consensus, certainly among unionist parties, that the UK Internal Market is worth preserving and enhancing. There are technical questions about how one does so, and I'm looking forward to the debates about those in which Alok Sharma and Bay's colleagues will engage. But there's a difference between that approach and the approach of Rodney's party. They don't believe in a UK internal market.
But with respect, an economic bill with huge constitutional issues, which is the subject of our correspondence over the summer, which is why you have Minister Smith also.
Oh, yes, no, I think that's right.
So I'm afraid to pretend that it is simply an economic bill.
It's primarily an economic measure, and it becomes even more important economically as we think about how we recover from COVID, because reducing costs for companies and for workers in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is part of the recovery programme overall. But you are right, of course. There are always constitutional questions when you're dealing with these matters.
And just finally, Chair, if I may, what concerns do you have about the desettlement of the very fragile situation in Northern Ireland with some of the parts of this bill?
My view is, but again, I know that there are many different views, that what the bill does is that it makes sure that Northern Ireland citizens and businesses have unfettered access to the rest of the United Kingdom. And that was one of the things that was guaranteed in the protocol, which is part of the withdrawal agreement, and the bill gives effect to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lloyd Russell-Moyle, please.
Secretary Gove, thank you very much. You mentioned about making devolution work, and I very much agree with that. As we all know, we constantly obsess about devolution in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, but its poorest sister in the question is actually what we do with England. Is England actually, how we deal with England, more important in making devolution work? Because whilst we have a British Parliament that also is an English Parliament, the Scot Nats and the Welsh Nats will constantly have a legitimate grievance that it is being done to them because there is not a clear delineation of power. And so how are you involved in some of those discussions around English devolution? And where would you see the direction of that travel going beyond just mayors?
Yes, well, I think, Lloyd, you raise a really very important question, in which there are a range of, I think, influential and important currents of opinion. I think the first thing to say is that the lead department, when it thinks about, in thinking about devolution in England, is MHCLG. A white paper is going to be published a wee bit later by Robert Jenrick, and it will look at some of these questions. It will look at the extension of mayors, as you point out. It will also look at the way in which we can perhaps revisit some aspects of the local government settlement, and it will also build on some of the successful devolution of powers that metro mayors and others have enjoyed. My own view is that I wouldn't want myself to dictate where this conversation should end, because I think it's important that we take account of the views of people in different parts of England. There is an issue, you're absolutely right, when you have the constituent parts of the United Kingdom and England forming 85% of the population, But I think that the important thing for us to do is to have a mature debate about how we can resolve that. I'm not myself a fan of what some people would call federalism, but I think the important thing to do is to have that respectful conversation, because constitutions evolve over time to take account of new challenges.
I take that you're not necessarily a supporter of federalism yourself, but if we, as you quite rightly pointed out, have England that has the bulk of the economic and population, and we constantly treat England as one homogenous block, even if we break down the power within England, versus another set of smaller blocks, constantly that imbalance of power is going to be where the grit in our union is. And is there not some sense in breaking down England, so we don't talk about England as what England is one homogenous block, but instead talk about the different cultural, political currents? And so therefore, is that not a question that's not just local government, but a question that should sit in your department, which is about the broader, how England fits in the Constitution?
Yes, I think it's a perfectly legitimate conversation, absolutely not just legitimate, important and vital, in which there are different views. My own view is that actually a sense of understandable pride in England and its history is a good thing. But I also recognise that there are, within England, there are local and regional identities
yes,
yeah, exactly. And we should just look at how local government and governance overall reflects that. So yes, MHCLG is the lead department. Rob Jenrick has been given a lot of thought to this. The excellent Simon Clarke, who stood down as Minister 2 days ago, did an enormous amount of work on this, and I just want to pay tribute to him. And again, whether in a select committee or elsewhere, I think it's a good thing to talk about. You know, I should say that some of the most interesting thinking about this has been done by people within the Labour tradition. So people like John Denham have been thinking about the position of England within the United Kingdom. And while I don't agree with everything he says, I think that he's opened up and led a very fruitful avenue of debate.
But from your department, and this is just to clarify, from your department, you don't necessarily think that relationship with England and Scotland and England and Wales and England and Northern Ireland should necessarily change. You're just talking here about the relationship of how power is split up within England.
Well, I'm always willing to look at ways in which we can make the United Kingdom overall stronger. So I have preferences and judgments based on experience, but it's always the case, as the experience which I alluded to that David Mundell had shows, that if a case can be made for additional steps that can be taken which strengthen the United Kingdom and adjust the devolution settlement in the right way, great. But the really important thing, I think, is we recognise the success of devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Don't do anything to undermine that, but work with the governments there in order to make it work. But the broader questions you raise are legitimate questions for medium to long-term debate.
And then finally, I just put this out there. Is there any discussions with your colleagues at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office about how our overseas territories fit into that constitutional arrangement going forward? I mean, Gibraltar clearly is now out of the European Union, will need to be part of a new constitutional settlement in terms of the market as well for them. So is your department leading on that, or is that again just something that is hived off to the Foreign Office and not part of that bigger constitutional settlement question?
It is part of a broader question. Narrowly, and I know you asked about the overseas territories, but the Crown dependencies are the responsibility of the Ministry of Justice, but I take a very close interest in the Crown dependencies and our relationship with them and our wider relationship with the world. But if you include the whole British family, including the overseas territories, I do take a close interest in that. The FCDO lead on that. But we do have discussions, and I've had discussions with Foreign Secretaries, past and present, about the Falklands, Gibraltar, and other OTs as well.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. A very quick supplementary question from Ronnie Cowan, please.
Yeah, just very briefly, Mr. Gove, you've said this a number of times that devolution's a great success. I'm just wondering, if it's such a great success for those of people who live in Scotland, why did the latest poll show 56% of people voting for independence?
Well, I think that we've seen over the course of the last 10 to 12 years, a significant, notwithstanding the recent challenges that the COVID pandemic has shown, a significant improvement in productivity in Scotland, in the economic performance of Scotland. What is striking, and I'm quoting, of course, from the response that the Scottish Government gave to our UK Internal Market White Paper, is how since 2008, 12 years ago, most of those 12 years, of course, you've had either a Conservative or a coalition government, Scotland's economy has improved. When I visit Scotland to see my mum and dad, or to be with friends, or to discharge my responsibilities, I'm struck by how rich Scotland's cultural life is, by how robust and attractive its institutions are, by how, notwithstanding everything that we've seen over the last few months, there is a spirit of enterprise and optimism. I'm also struck by the fact that most folk think that actually a really important thing for politicians at the moment to do is to concentrate on working together to get through the COVID crisis, to improve our economy, to improve schools and hospitals, and constitutional matters, while they matter to you and me, are never very high on their list of priorities.
Thank you. David Jones, please.
Yes, just briefly, may I say from a Welsh perspective how very pleased I am that the government is introducing the UK Internal Market Bill, which will be hugely appreciated by Welsh businesses.
Thank you, David. And it's certainly the case that there have been a number of Welsh businesses that have been in touch with us to say that they are glad that this legislation is putting everything on a firmer footing.
The Cabinet Office webpage describes the role of the office as supporting the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, of course, has got his own establishment in number 10. Could you explain how the Cabinet Office works with the number 10 establishment?
Yes. Essentially, it's like a sort of gearing mechanism within the machinery of government. The Cabinet Office is an additional cog that makes sure that government machinery overall does what the Prime Minister wants. In narrow accounting terms, number 10, the Prime Minister's private office, his policy unit and so on, fall within the Cabinet Office overall in terms of spending. But I don't think anyone would suggest that even though it's the Cabinet Office spending settlement overall that pays for it, that we're anything other than servants of the Prime Minister. So the Cabinet Office is there to make sure that the Prime Minister's priorities and the government's manifesto are implemented. It has particular responsibilities when it comes to the efficiency of the operation of government, the resilience of our constitution, and also at the moment preparation for the end of the transition period.
And therefore, I imagine there's a very close interface between the staff of the Cabinet Office and the staff of number 10.
Absolutely. And so the new Cabinet Secretary was a Cabinet Office official who then went to work for the Prime Minister in number 10 and who, of course, is now Cabinet Secretary. Famously, you move from the Cabinet Office to number 10 by going through a single link door. The two physical departments are linked in that way. And it is often the case that officials from the Prime Minister's private office or the policy unit will be meeting with officials in the Cabinet Office and also the Treasury to cooperate on the government's priorities.
We've heard a lot about the new collaboration hub within the Cabinet Office. Could you describe its work, please?
Yes, it's attracted a lot of outside attention, and I wouldn't want to exaggerate its significance, nor would I want to minimise it. In essence, it is a way of co-locating some of those who work in the Cabinet Office Secretariat and who are responsible for preparing the papers for Cabinet committees and for government decision with individuals from the Prime Minister's policy unit in order to make sure that the policies which are at the heart of the government and the material that's generated for ministers to make decisions can be shared in the same room. But it is another manifestation of something that's happened throughout the years, and I think across administrations, where the centre works together in order to make sure the Prime Minister's priorities are delivered.
And is it a Cabinet Office body, or is it a number 10 one?
It's Cabinet Office, and it will have Cabinet Office and number 10 staff working in it.
And is it staffed by political appointees or by permanent civil service, or a mixture of both?
A mixture, because the Prime Minister's policy unit has traditionally had a mixture of secondees from elsewhere in the civil service and people from outside who are appointed, some of whom will have a political background, some of whom don't. They'll be hired because of their, obviously they'll have political views, but they'll be hired because of their expertise and authority in particular disciplines.
And what is the chain of command, so to speak, within there? Is it headed by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff?
Well, I imagine that, because we're still in the process of resolving all of these questions, that people will be ultimately answerable in that office to, ultimately answerable to the Cabinet Secretary, but whether or not it is the case that the Permanent Secretary at number 10, if a new one is appointed, which I imagine they will be, or the Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary would be the person who would be IC there.
So that remains to be determined?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
And building on that metaphor, is that famous door ever locked at the moment?
I've never seen it locked. You need a pass to get through, and there are some people whose faces are sufficiently familiar over time, not necessarily to need that pass. So, when
it would suggest a very close relationship between the Cabinet Office and number 10.
Yes.
Thank you. Jackie Doyle-Price, please.
Sorry. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about communications and how the government is going to be running that going forward. I mean, why do you think that greater centralisation of government communications in the Cabinet Office is necessary?
Well, one of the things that Francis Maude, as Cabinet Office Minister, did when he was my predecessor, is to bring together certain cross-government functions. So whether it's the management of the government's property estate, or the management of the government's digital service, or the provision of legal advice across government, rather than each department going its own way, there were economies of scale, and there was a greater level of coordination if all of them came together. So GCS, the Government Communication Service, preceded this Prime Minister or my own arrival in office. Communications overall changes and evolves over time. You need to make sure that you keep pace with modern platforms and modern media. But what is being contemplated is simply the next refinement of a process that had already been in place in the past.
Okay, so how does that work then in terms of messaging? Because obviously the government will have its overall narrative. I mean, if we take, for example, the coronavirus response, clearly that's a cross-government issue. And there is obviously good reasons to centralise communications, not least to get consistency of message when you've got many departments involved. But equally, there will be other areas of policy which are much more niche, where the audience is perhaps not the general public, but perhaps individual professions, for example. Totally. So how do we get the balance right? How do you see that playing out in future in terms of what would be managed centrally and what individual departments would do, particularly in terms of setting that message?
Well, I think that's a very important point. And I think that we can describe potential situations, but we won't know everyone in advance. But as a general rule, I think you're right. If you've got something like a pandemic, well, DHSC will be in the lead. Other government departments will have to coordinate their message as appropriate with it. But also, to take DHSC as an example, it will have a relationship with specialist titles, and it will have a relationship with its own staff, and indeed the employees in the NHS, which will require communications professionals whose job is very much to make sure that those specific specialist channels are properly communicated through. So again, it's not quite you know it when you see it, but I think it's a process of, like in any organisation, working out what is it that we should do effectively centrally, what is it that we should leave devolved, how do we ensure that there's an appropriate process of reviewing when that balance may need to change.
So I guess what's sitting about a general area of concern that people have expressed is that there is a risk that messages could become overtly politicised through centralisation. But from what you've just said, the centralisation appears to be more about operational nuts and bolts rather than messaging.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think it's important that the government of the day is clear about its priorities, clear about why it's choosing to deliver them, candid and takes people into its confidence about some of the challenges, but also some of the achievements. But there's a distinction that's drawn between the civil service implementing the government's policies of the day and explicitly political activity, and that distinction absolutely needs to be maintained.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, please.
Thank you, Chair. You said in your recent Ditchley lecture that you suggested that the civil service should be subject to significant reform. So far, we've seen permanent secretaries replaced. Can we expect to see a programme setting out for an agenda for civil service reform at any point?
Yes, I hope so. Our intention is that, and one thing, I know that it would seem unfair to pick you up on this one verb. When you talked about imposition, the one thing I would say, and different people would draw their own conclusion, is that civil service reform and change is something that we'll be doing with the civil service, not to the civil service, and that is why I'm working with colleagues in the Cabinet Office to draw up an outline paper which will put flesh on the thin bones of what I said at Ditchley, and of course what the Permanent Secretary Alex Chisholm has said at Civil Service Live and elsewhere. But the short answer is yes.
The Prime Minister's Chief Advisor has suggested that civil service should be subject to hard rain. So if you're working with them, they're not going to be subject to hard rain.
No, those words were attributed to the Prime Minister's Chief Advisor at a particular meeting. I wasn't in the meeting. I have colleagues who were. They don't recall him, and there were three of them. They don't recall him having said that. So, my understanding of the reporting is that this was one rare occasion where there was a mishearing, but that's what I was told. I've never heard him use that phrase.
And in terms of the makeup of the civil service, in the lecture, I think you said you wanted the civil service to be less southern, less middle class, less anywhere, more somewhere.
Yes.
How do we achieve that without does that require greater political intervention in the recruitment and management of the civil service? How do we achieve that aim?
I don't think political, but I think ministerial and civil service leadership. One of the things that the Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office, Alex Chisholm, and I are highly motivated to achieve is a greater dispersal of jobs across the United Kingdom through a programme called Places for Growth. One of the things that the coronavirus pandemic has reinforced is that we don't need to have every civil servant based, not that they are, but you know what I mean, in Whitehall. And so I think that greater dispersal of roles is a good thing in terms of broadening the talent pool, and also a good thing in terms of helping to support economic growth and recovery across the United Kingdom. And I think there's a broader question. We always need to look at, any organisation always has a tendency to recruit in its own image. And one of the things I just wanted to do was to make sure that we were as diverse as possible. When I was interviewed by Gloria De Piero, the former Labour MP on Times Radio the other week, she pointed out to me the relative lack of people in the senior civil service who'd come from particularly challenging schools and socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think we've got to do better in that regard. Final thing I would say just at this stage is that everything that I said in the Ditchley lecture was my view, but I shared it beforehand with a variety of civil servants, including permanent secretaries. They made improvements to it. I'm not saying that everyone agreed with everything that I said, but the whole point of it was that it was designed to be a collaborative exercise, and it was designed for that reason because I've had the benefit of working with great civil servants throughout my career, and I wanted to reflect that in what I was saying.
So the forecast then is for balmy sunshine rather than hard rain?
Well, I think that all of us in government face some challenging times ahead, but the key thing is that we can only meet those challenges if we ensure that the civil service, as it, in my view, always has done, is true to the virtues of integrity, impartiality, objectivity, candour, that has always marked it out. And, there will be challenges ahead, but as we navigate those challenges, what I know the civil service will do is to provide data-rich, well-evidenced judgments about what ministers should or should not do, and then ministers will decide.
And is there anything perhaps comparable for ministers? Because in fairness to you, in your dictionary lecture, you know, ministers, as we know, are not infallible. So is there a data-rich matrix that you can judge the quality and usefulness of ministers as well as their civil servants?
I think I'm talking about the evidence that civil servants will provide, but I think it's a very fair challenge. And one of the questions in my mind is, politics has an inherent volatility. But what can we do to better prepare people who might become ministers for that responsibility, and what can we better do to support ministers in the exercise of their responsibility? I mean, ultimately, politics is about judgment and fulfilling a democratic mandate. And no training, no matrix can ever substitute for judgment and accountability. But we can all do our jobs better, and sharing experience, certainly from those who've done it before, can help. I probably won't surprise you to know, even though I disagree with them on lots of things, I've benefited from hearing directly from Michael Heseltine and Peter Mandelson about how to do the job, and whatever mistakes I've made fewer as a result of what they've told me.
The same question can be asked as committee chairman as well, I assure you of that. But can I go to a supplementary from David Mundell, please?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Gove, one thing that concerned me, including during my time in office, was the very small number of civil servants in the higher echelons of Whitehall who'd had experience of working within the devolved administrations. And likewise now within the devolved administrations, I'm not as familiar with Wales and Northern Ireland, but certainly the Scottish Government, of individuals there who've worked within Whitehall. And is there any mechanisms or ideas in play to try and improve that exchange of individuals? Because as this committee's been told, we still operate a one civil service approach.
You're right. It happens. It doesn't happen often enough. There are people whom I work with at DEFRA who went on to work with the Welsh Government and very, very good civil servants. I would ideally like to see more of it happen, and that's one of the things that both I and Alex Chisholm are keen to promote.
Thank you. David Jones, please.
Yes, at Ditchley, you also said that the civil service should better reflect the 52%
yes.
Who voted to leave the European Union. Does that tend to confirm the suspicion that there has been abroad among certain people who did vote to leave the European Union, that the civil service, or at least the senior echelons, are staffed by people who would rather we were remaining?
No, it's a very good question, and let me give and let me try to answer it as fully as possible, as briefly as possible. The first thing is that I think that many of us who live and work and operate in SW1, this has changed over time as a result of the general election, but still, many of the people within this village have not exhibited an understanding, a deep understanding, as you have, David, of the reasons why people voted to leave. And I think it's deepening that understanding that is important, and it's an understanding of what our ultimate masters, the British public, feel and think and want from government. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't know how, with one or two exceptions, very rare exceptions, any civil servant with whom I work has voted. But what I do know is that every civil servant with whom I've worked, particularly on Brexit, and I've been involved both at DEFRA and in the Cabinet Office on implementation of policies for the end of the transition period, everyone with whom I've worked has worked very energetically to advance the government's agenda. So it may well be that there were some civil servants who voted to remain and regretted the judgment, but I couldn't tell you who they were. What I can tell you is everyone with whom I've worked has done everything they can to advance the agenda of the elected government of the day as put forward by ministers.
So could you describe precisely what you think is lacking there that needs to reflect that 52%?
I think there is a broader question, and it's less about any department, any group of individuals. It's just a broader question as well. You sometimes find that people ascribe to those who voted to leave a set of motives, which in my view doesn't do justice to the range of factors that lay behind that. And the Prime Minister, in the levelling up agenda that he has outlined, I think gets to the heart of it. And I think that one of the things that we need to recognise is that over time there were more people across the United Kingdom who felt that the political classes weren't responsive, weren't listening, didn't understand their concerns. I don't think it's a purely Leave Remain thing, but I think that the referendum was probably the biggest moment that revealed or laid bare some of those concerns. And again, one of the things I would stress is that, and it follows on partly from what Lloyd said earlier, North Wales is a part of the UK which perhaps insufficient people who live and work in London know, understand, and have had the chance both to visit and to work in. You will appreciate that there are political currents, economic feelings, and so on that your constituents have that are sometimes poorly reflected, say, in what the BBC might broadcast at certain moments. So I'm trying not to be critical of anyone. What I'm trying to do is to say we need to promote that understanding. I'm sure you know and could list some of the ways in which occasionally, even with the best will in the world, well-intentioned and generous-hearted people sometimes subscribe to a caricature of some of our other citizens, and I think it's trying to move beyond that, which is important.
So this does not imply the end to the Northcote-Trevelyan principle of political impartiality?
Absolutely not. I think there is a key distinction to be drawn. Civil servants must be impartial and objective. That doesn't mean they're neutral, because civil servants, as I mentioned, are there to implement the policies of the government of the day. I think, partly in response to Tom's question, we can always look about broadening the talent pool. But I think the other thing is that it's no diminution of objectivity to seek to extend people's sympathy and understanding of all the citizens in this country. And then the one other thing about Northcote-Trevelyan is you also do need political appointees in government, and you draw an appropriate distinction. I think special advisors play an absolutely critical role, and the reason why you need special advisors is that they should be doing things and providing certain advice which you would not want a civil servant to.
There have, of course, been efforts previously for many years to promote diversity in the civil service in terms of ethnicity, gender, disability, and so on. Does your speech, should we read from it that in fact that has been a failure, or it hasn't gone far enough, or it's been wrongly targeted, or what?
It's absolutely critical, but there is more to do. So I think the civil service has improved, as most major employers have improved over the course of the last few years, in drawing people from diverse ethnic backgrounds, in ensuring that there is a better representation of women and people living with disabilities across the board and in senior positions. But there is more to do. That is absolutely vital. There's something else as well, which is I'd like to promote intellectual diversity. So people who see things from different points of view. And again, I'm not talking about left-right. I'm just talking about people who can look at problems in different ways. And that's a really valuable part of any organisation.
I wonder if we could talk about churn in the civil service, which has been identified as a problem for many years, in fact, not least by predecessors of this committee.
Yeah.
How do you propose to tackle churn, and why do you think that it's remained a problem despite having been identified as one for so long?
I think it's partly the way in which the career structure of the civil service is oriented. There are tools in the toolbox for permanent secretaries and others to encourage people to stay in particular post. Something called the Pivotal Roles Allowance enables greater reward to be given, and other appropriate bonuses. But there's often an incentive, if you look at the past, for people to have to move department and have to move responsibility in order to secure promotion. I think it's become more acute recently, and the Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office and I are looking at different ways in which we can change that in order to allow government departments to be more flexible so that people can rise within their profession, get that reward both in terms of status, income and other areas without them having to leave the department and move into another area.
I mean, it's clearly a significant problem, and
yes.
It seems to have defeated many predecessors of yours. So
yes.
How hopeful are you that you'll be able to resolve the issue?
Hopeful, but there will always be some failures along the way. So I'm sure, not failures, imperfections. So I hope we can improve the situation, but I don't think that, I think there'll still be some moments when ministers or permanent secretaries will regret the fact that someone whom they very much want to hold on to will be lost to them, but hopefully the situation will be better.
How concerned are you about the current level of churn among permanent secretaries in various departments?
Well, I've enjoyed working with some of those who've left the government over the course of the last 12 months, and I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to those people with whom I work particularly closely. Richard Heaton, as Permanent Secretary of MHA, I really enjoyed working with. Claire Moriarty, I worked with at DEFRA. She departed, as it happens, because the department for which she was responsible, DEXU, in which she served with distinction as a minister, David, had reached the end of its natural existence. But historically, it is the case that in other years, there's been a bigger churn at the top. So, for example, in 2005, 12 permanent secretaries moved on. In 2007, 11, and that's more than have done so this year. So I think it's important to look at it in historical context.
Could I just interrupt there? Because I think when David Jones talks of churn, it was about people moving between departments. I think
yes.
It's a bit of a confusion to pretend.
My apologies.
Not at all. But can I just bring, and interrupting David as I am, bring Karen Smith in with a supplementary question at this juncture?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I would support what you've said, Mr. Gove, about diversity and breadth, both intellectually, with more women, black minorities, etc. But for the civil service, but do you think it's incumbent on politicians and the government to ensure that that is reflected in special advisors as well? So, what is the government's view of diversity and recruitment and retention amongst special advisors?
My view is that it should apply across the board. In an ideal world, parliamentary parties should be more diverse as well.
I think some of us are doing better than others on that, but is the government taking active steps with ministers to encourage greater diversity with special advisors?
Yes.
And how is that going?
I think that if you look overall, you'll see that we have a range of individuals from a variety of different backgrounds, and there are some minority characteristics that are better represented than others, but we continue to strive for diversity overall.
And the majority population, 51% women, how is that going?
I'd be able to tell you, I don't have the full list of special advisors in front of me, exactly what the proportion is.
You can write to the committee afterwards.
I certainly will. And I think there may be some special advisors who may be covered by the protected characteristics of the Equalities Act, who may not wish to necessarily reveal aspects of it, but we'll do our very best to provide you with that matrix.
Respect their
Just very quickly, as we draw to a close, could I ask how many of the Cabinet Office's civil servants have returned to work at least part-time from the office since the government encouraged other businesses to adopt that approach?
I'll have those figures tomorrow, and I'll give them to the committee as soon as we have them. It varies depending on site by site, but I will give you those figures.
Could I just ask what the government has learnt from the pandemic and home working, and how that might affect an estate strategy going forward?
A lot. And one of the things that my colleague Lord Agnew is seeking to do is to make sure that we reduce our footprint in London overall, and that where home working is appropriate, we facilitate that, but also where we can have responsibilities and indeed potentially whole departments operating outside London, that we do that as well.
Okay, well, that was an hour's session. It was a canter through that, and we're looking forward to seeing you again in a few weeks' time, which we can explore those issues in greater depth. Can I just thank the committee members for their attendance this afternoon, and for you, Michael. Order.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Sound. Committee Room 6, sound. Committee Room 6, sound. Committee Room 6, sound.